Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Bob Austin for extending the invitation. I've never been here before. It's a beautiful facility. You're very fortunate to have it. A quick question, Bob. Does this mic work? Does the portable? Or can you all hear me if I step away? Can you hear me in the back? I hate standing in one place. It drives me crazy. So I'll speak loud. Tell me if you can't hear me. It's a pleasure to talk about this subject. I've been working on the Windover skeletons for, 11 years now, ever since I graduated with my PhD. And this book just came out in March of this year, and it's been a long time in coming. It's amazing how many people in Florida still don't know about the Windover site, and as Chris said, it is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, and tonight you'll learn why. It's not only a significant site because of the uniqueness of the burials, but also because of the incredible preservation we have at the site, the array of artifacts, and all of the things that came along with this wonderful site. So you're going to learn the story of the site's discovery. That's what I've tried to do in the book, is tell the story of not only the site, but the people who worked on the site. That's why I entitled it Life and Death at Windover. I didn't want to only tell the story of the dead individuals that came from the pond, but the people that brought their talents and skills together to make this incredible excavation possible. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, it was 1982, and let me see, so yes, okay. Construction was being started on what would become Windover Farms housing development, and this is located right in downtown Titusville, which is directly across the state from where we are now. And a man named Jim Swan, who was a very successful land developer. He had the good fortune of marrying into the Eckerd family fortune. His stepfather was Mr. Eckerd. So they went into business together to develop land in Florida. So they bought a large tract of land outside of Titusville to develop it into Windover Farms. And what Jim Swan envisioned was, large ranch-style houses, but left on large lots, because not only is he a land developer, but he's also an environmentalist, which is a very strange combination in land development, as most of you know. But had it not been for his interests in conservation and the environment, this site probably never would have been excavated. Well, he had hired a man named Steve Vanderjack, who owned this backhoe, and they were starting the initial construction to put in the main road system that would wind its way through the housing development. So Steve Vanderjack, I met him at his home to interview him for the book. In fact, Jim Swan was the first man I interviewed for the book. I had never conducted an interview before. Even though I'm an anthropologist, I'm a skeletal person, so I didn't know what I was doing. So I had my brand new tape recorder, and I put it on the desk, and Jim Swan's kind of a gruff, kind of an intimidating figure, and he sat down with me, and the first thing he said was, "I don't remember anything." And I thought, oh my God, so I turned on the tape recorder, but he did. He remembered a tremendous amount, and we spoke for almost an hour as he recounted the site's discovery. And so I also met with Steve Vanderjack, the backhoe operator, because I really wanted to see what it was like for that first person who saw the first bone to come out of the ground. So I went out to Steve's home over on the coast and sat down with him, and he told me about his life, how he moved down from up north to find work, and he had brought his backhoe along with him. And so I said, well, tell me about that morning. It was early spring, it was 1982, and they were just getting started. And he said that, through his career as a backhoe operator, he always kind of watched what came out of the ground. He always kept an eye on his bucket, because he had found some really cool stuff, like old big bones and historic bottles and interesting things. So he said he was just working along out there by himself, and he happened to see this big stone kind of tumble out of the bucket. And he thought, we don't have big rocks like that in Florida. It's all sand. So he climbed down. He went down, climbed up on the spoil pile, and when he picked up that stone and turned it over in his hand, what he had was a human skull. And I asked him at the time of the interview, I said, what was the first thing that came to mind? And he said, oh, I can't say it. I'm like, say it. He said, oh, shit. And so I said, well, what'd you do? Did you stop work? Did you go get someone? He said, no, I got back on the backhoe and I took 2 more swipes out of the base of that pond, because he had been tasked with demucking this little small pond that was in the way of the road. And so, he was just scraping out the muck and peat from the base of this when that stone happened to fall out. So he got back on, he took 2 more swipes, and sure enough, he saw more human remains come out and be deposited onto the spoil pile. So it was at that point when he stopped work and went and notified Jim Swan. So they went out to the spoil pile. Jim said that they collected all the bones they could find, put them in big buckets, and they walked across the roadway because there was a trooper station across the way. And so they walk into the trooper station with 2 big buckets full of bones, and they're like, what do we do with this? And I said, well, what did the trooper say? And he said, well, he looked at us, looked at the bones, and he said, we only do car wrecks. And he sent them on their way. So I said, well, what do you do next? And so they finally notified the local law enforcement, who brought out a medical examiner, and they deemed them prehistoric in nature. So through a convoluted network of calls, they finally notified Glenn Doran. In fact, Jim Swan had a lot of political connections. So one of his political connections was very good friends with the president at the time of Florida State University. And back then in 1982, Glenn Doran was a young, brand new professor. He'd only been there at Florida State about 2 years. And he said he came in one afternoon and he found a handwritten note on his desk that said, bones, call this number. So he called the number, and sure enough, it was Jim Swan. And Jim said, look, we've got these human remains coming out of this small pond. So Doran made his way down, and the first thing he noticed when he got there, he said that when they took him out onto the site, they took him to the spoil pile, and there were still some human remains out there, but he noticed there was no pottery. So it piqued his interest because, pottery in Florida goes back about 4,500 years. So anytime we come upon a site that lacks pottery, we think, hey, this could be a pretty old site. But the other thing he really noticed was the teeth. And if you look at these, this is the mandible, the lower jaw, this is the upper jaw. He noticed that these teeth had a lot of wearing on them. And that was his first hint that these were probably prehistoric populations because, our diets are very soft and refined. We don't wear our teeth down like this the way prehistoric populations did. So he told Swan, he said, the only way we can truly know the significance of this site, because they didn't know if they just had a couple of individuals in the base of the pond, they didn't know what it was. Glenn said, we need some radiocarbon dates, but I don't have any money, I'm a new professor. And Swan said, well, how much does it cost? And he said, well, about $250 per sample. And Swan said, I'll pay for it. So he actually paid for the radiocarbon dating. And when the dates came back, they came back at over 7,000 years. So it's completely stunned all of them. They were never expecting these things to be that old. So Swan, again, used his political connections and was able to get funding for the first year of excavation. Now, this was by 1984. They got about $200,000 for the first field season. They were going to work in late winter, kind of come in November, December, and work for a couple of months. But Glenn had never done this type of excavation work before. He said, I had never worked in a pond. I didn't know anything about, underwater archaeology or wet site archaeology. So what he did was he called his good buddy Dave Dickel, and they had gone to school out in California together. They're both trained as bioarchaeologists, meaning they specialize in the analysis of human remains, but they're also archaeologists. And Dave Dickel was running his own CRM firm out in California. And so Glenn said, Dave, you got to come out and help me with this site because it could be something pretty significant. We've got some really old dates. We don't know how many people are in the base of this pond. So Dave jumped in his Volkswagen van and drove all the way across the country, and they got started. And you'll see some of these excavation shots. But the first thing they had to figure out was, how do you do archaeology in a pond? Because it was a pond full of water. Well, it took them about 2 field seasons to kind of work out the bugs, and what they finally did was establish a system of well points around the periphery of the pond. That's this white piping that you see. Those well points are actually driven down into the peat of the pond, and it just evacuated the water, dumped it into a nearby slough. But it was pretty precarious work because they had to dry the site out enough that the excavators could work in it, but if they dried it out too much, it would crack any skeletal material that was still in the pond. So it took them a little while to devise the right strategy, but after about the first field season, they had it down. Here are some of the early shots showing them hooking up these large pumps to the well points, and as you can imagine, it was filthy, very labor-intensive work. But by the time they've kind of perfected it, you can see this is the pond minus the water. Here are some of the excavators working in it. And what you'll notice is this nice, beautiful, thick black matrix in the base of that pond. And it's that black matrix that was responsible for the beautiful preservation that resulted in this site. Because this pond just happened to be of a neutral pH, which is very unusual when you have such heavy layers of peat. But it was this peat environment, this anaerobic environment that the skeletons were placed in that afforded incredible preservation of the majority of the skeletons. Here are some of the early excavation shots. This is of Glenn. Here's a burial that's been pedestaled, meaning it's been excavated down around each bone, so it looks like it's up on a pedestal, so that they can photograph it and map it and take all the coordinates to cover the provenience of everything that came out of the pond. Here's Dave working on another burial. And I asked Dave when I interviewed him, because I had been working with Glenn and Dave for several years when I was going to school, but I asked Dave, I said, what was it like working in that peat? Because, you know, you couldn't just scrape it like you do with the sand in regular Florida using a trowel. He said what they had to do is every morning they'd come out and they'd sharpen their instruments just to razor sharpness, because that was the only way they could slice through this thick peat. He said it was like slicing through cheese. It was so thick. And he said they had to be really careful wielding their shovels and things because they kept their instruments so sharp. But here's some shots, and you can see kind of those thick walls of the matrix, how thick it is. But the skeletons that came out of this peat matrix, most of them were very well preserved. And by the second field season in 1985, they started finding some more discrete burials. The first field season, they found a lot of fragmented remains. They kind of tested different areas within the pond till they finally hit upon really beautiful discrete burials. Most of the burials were in this flex position. This is one of the unique ones that is actually extended. And if we take a look at her up close, she's actually buried face down. Here's her head, here are her hips. But if we look a little more closely, between her legs is actually a little hand-woven bag that contained the remnants of a fetus. So she probably died in childbirth. She and the baby were buried together. So not only do these skeletons hold a tremendous amount of information about the past, but each of these burials kind of tells a story about the individuals in life as well. Now, many of the skeletons that came out, especially the subadults or the children, were not as well preserved because, as you can imagine, small, fragile skeletons are crushed over time with the weight of that peat accumulation. So many of them required some pretty substantial reconstruction. But aside from the reconstruction, one of the most important tasks that took place back at the lab was assigning little numbers, provenience numbers, to every little bit of bone that came out of the ground. And one of the individuals volunteering in those labs was Vera Zimmerman. And Vera lives over on the East Coast. She's very active in the FAS chapter over there. She's been kind of in archaeology for a long time. But 30 years ago, when this site was first excavated, she had just moved to the area. And she was kind of perfectly suited for this work, she said, because she's very nearsighted. And she said, you know, I could work on those little tiny bits of bone and put those numbers, because this little white stuff, what you see, are tiny little numbers. Every little bit of bone that came out of the ground had a little burial number on it. And that's the only way they could keep control over every piece of skeletal material that came out. So Vera was one of those that assisted in cataloging every bit of bone and artifact that came out of the ground. Now, not only did they catch incredible skeletal elements, but they also wanted to catch any artifacts that may have been placed in this pond. And they did that through a system of wet screening. And wet screening is very common in archaeology. It's a great way to kind of force thick matrix through a screen. And you use those screens, of course, to catch everything that's been placed in the ground. So they would set up big bucket brigades of those big green pickle buckets. And they'd scoop out, you know, excavate into those buckets. They'd haul the buckets up to the screens, and then they'd dump them and pressure, you know, wash that matrix through the screens. And not only did they catch skeletons, but they caught some amazing artifacts, things that were buried with these individuals. And one of the people that was tasked with analyzing these was a young grad student at the time, Tom Penders. And Tom had a real fascination with how Native Americans in ancient Florida made objects, the materials they used, what these objects were used for. So Glenn Dorn tasked Tom with analyzing the artifacts from Windover, and what he found was that they were utilizing many different types of materials, as this picture shows. They were utilizing stone, bone, wood, antler, really anything they could get their hands on from the natural environment for their tools, for their utilitarian objects. They were using objects for adornment like shell and shark's teeth. You can see on this shark's tooth has two little drilled holes, so it may be worn as a pendant. And Tom did his master's thesis on the artifacts from Windover. And so every aspect of the site that we're talking about tonight is a chapter in the book, because Glenn Dorn in 2001 put out a giant edited volume about the Windover site, about all the science of the site. And I wanted to kind of mimic that layout about the different aspects of the site, but do it for a general reader. Because if you've ever seen his Windover book, you know, you could kill a small child with it, it's so big. So this one is much more user-friendly, but it's broken up the same way, and the artifacts make up one of the chapters. These artifacts give us an idea of how people were procuring their food, because we can look at items that were used as tools and weapons and kind of infer what they were used for. This is the entire lithic assemblage from Windover, only 5 small stone points. And that could have been because, you know, some of these sources are kind of rare. They may have had to travel long distances to get the proper stone for these points. They were also making fishing barbs, so they were utilizing their water resources in the area. They were also utilizing objects to possibly create clothing. Some of these may have been used to create some of the objects we'll see in a little bit. You can see they were using antler, bone, a lot of deer bone. But another astounding aspect of the site was about 2 feet, at the end of the second field season, they started finding this gunky material on top of some of the bones. And Dickel said that when they go to excavate it, to kind of peel it off the bones, it would just disintegrate. And it wasn't until they started finding flat bones of the body, like the hips and skulls, with actual impressions, that they realized they were dealing with hand-woven textiles that were created 7,000 years ago. And the stuff was highly degraded. It was probably made of palm fiber, either sable or royal palm. But you can see this is one of the few actual photographs we have of it, because it was such a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Fragile, very fragile. And so it took James Ottavasio, who is one of the top textile experts in the world, came to the site. He was tasked with preserving these. So again, there's another chapter in the book that talks about the different kind of methodology that they really employed and kind of created specifically for these textiles. And the way the textiles were utilized were as in burial shrouds. Over half the individuals in the pond were actually wrapped in this matting, this hand-woven fabric that was probably created on a small loom that was held on the lap. But these textiles were not simple textiles. They were very elaborate. They had very concentrated designs to them, and they make up one of the most ancient, elaborate textile assemblages from North America. Now, this is an artist's rendering of what the burials would have looked like. This is a cross-section of the pond. Here's the surface of the pond, and here's how these individuals would have been interred. The majority of them were placed in a tucked or a flex position, most of them on their left side. They were wrapped in these textiles. Objects, when they were buried with grave goods, were placed next to the body. And the entire assemblage would have been waded out into the pond, pushed down into the muck of the pond, and then an erection of sticks were placed over the body, kind of teepee style, bless you, to anchor the body to the base of the pond. And it was this method of interment that pushed them down into the peat, and it was that peat that preserved them. Some of the sticks they found in isolation. They feel they may have been serving as grave markers, maybe to mark the location of either bodies or of family groups. But after 3 field seasons working primarily in the winter, they excavated 168 people from the base of this small pond. And another astounding aspect of this was that they did dating of different aspects of the pond, like different areas of the peat, different pieces of wood, bone, some of the textiles. And what they found was that this pond was primarily used in the late summer, early fall, and they based that on the botanicals, but that this site had probably been used for up to 1,000 years. So the people from Windover this was part of their annual migration. They were coming into the area in the late summer, early fall. They were probably camping nearby. Whoever happened to die while they were at that location was probably placed in this pond, but it was a place they were returning to year after year, generation after generation. And here's one of the wooden stakes that were used to kind of anchor the body to the base of the pond. Well, another fascinating aspect that was also discovered in the second field season was the presence of brain tissue, still in 91 of the crania that were excavated from the pond. And I asked Dave, what that was like when they first started discovering it. And he said that it was late one afternoon and he was excavating the remnants of a kind of a shattered skull that had been flattened. And as he was lifting the pieces of crania up, he noticed kind of some mucky stuff that was underneath the cranial bits. And he said at first he thought it was just part of the peat because it had a lot of the same consistency and color. And he said he even came back that night to camp and he was talking to Glenn about it, saying, what could that be? What could that stuff be? And Glenn said, it's probably just snail poop. Don't even worry about it. Well, it wasn't until they discovered an intact cranium, were able to peer down into the foramen magnum, that they realized that they were actually dealing with brain tissue. And so you can see that some of them were very well preserved. Most of them that were intact like this were kind of shriveled from being in water for 7,000 years. Some of them were just kind of more mucky in nature. But you can see the wide variety of preservation. The better preserved the skull, the better preserved, and the better chance you had of getting brain tissue out of them. And as I like to say, this is probably the female brains, those are the male brains. But those brain tissues, anytime a skull was discovered that had brain tissue, it was placed into a cooler. And at the end of the day, those skulls were transported in the cooler down to Wusthof Hospital in Rockledge, which is just south of Cocoa. And they were placed in the pathology department along with, normal tissue specimens. And what they would do is at night, the radiography techs would come in and scan them and radiograph them at night so it didn't interfere with patient care. But here's some of the scanning one of these crania. Here's one of the radiographs. Here's a scan. They did cross-sectioning. They were really hoping to get DNA from these soft tissues, but it was so fragmented after being in the water for so long that the DNA they did finally get from the skeletons, they got from the hard tissue. Now, as you can imagine, especially when the brains started being found, press for the site just was increasing exponentially. And Glenn was finding that, over time, every single day when he should have been out at the site, he was just sitting on the phone telling the story again and again of the site's discovery. Well, his wife happened to be a PR expert who worked for local county government in Tallahassee, and she knew of a woman. She said, you need to hire Madeline Carr, because Madeline had a broad background in PR. In fact, when I interviewed her, she told me the most fascinating life history. She actually started out, she was from England, and she started out in the jazz industry. She used to promote these huge jazz festivals across England and across Europe. And so, but here she was working on this ancient site, and she said when they brought her on board, the first thing she did was erect a safety fence, a security fence around the site, because up until that point, for the whole first field season, they had no security around the site. And they said that the excavators would show up in the morning getting ready to dig, and they'd see footprints through the excavations of people that had snuck in at night. So she put up a fence, but she also realized the unique opportunity they had to educate the public, to use this site to let people know how fascinating archaeology is, and especially archaeology in Florida. So she started programs. They started opening up the site on certain days, and they'd let just hordes of people come in and walk through, and they would guide them through the site, and she would establish volunteers at different locations, and each volunteer had a little spiel to give. One would talk about the textiles, the other would talk about maybe the artifacts, but they'd kind of rehearse their little spiel so that when the public moved through, they were getting a lot of information about all the different aspects of the site. She also engaged the local schools in the area. Kids could come in on Fridays and actually have lunch with an archaeologist, so they'd bring their brown bags and they could sit down with one of the excavators and hear what it was like to work the excavations. So it was a wonderful opportunity to really do some public archaeology. Now, a little science of the site. This is a topographic map of or a contour map of the base of the pond, showing kind of the contours of that base. The central part, was fairly deep for such a small small pond, but every one of these little red dots are a burial. So you can see kind of in the center, they tended to slough together a little. We have several commingled burials that are kind of hard to tease apart because they've become intermingled over time. The individuals in the central part of the pond were also much better preserved than those on the periphery, because you can imagine in years of drought, these ones closer to the surface, bless you, would have dried out as water levels dropped and filled back in. And to give you an idea of what someone may have looked like who lived back then, Glenn Dorn was actually able to take one of the skulls over to Scotland, and they had a brand new computer program that actually rebuilt soft tissue on top of bone. So this is one of the females from Windover and what she may have looked like in life, just to give you an idea. Now, how did I become involved in Windover? Well, I came 20-some years later. In '82, I was still, graduating from high school, and I had taken a kind of a different route. I was going to UCF studying anthropology, but I was kind of anxious and fidgety and wanted to kind of get out of work. So instead, I became a firefighter paramedic. And I had always had a love of medicine and science, so I went through the fire academy, went through paramedic school, was hired by Orlando Fire Department, and went on to have an incredible 13-year career, which I loved. But in the meantime, I went ahead and got my degree in anthropology. I also got a master's in public administration, but I really wanted to do archaeology full time. So after I became vested at OFD after 11 years, I retired from OFD and I went up to Florida State. But it was during my time as a paramedic that I really became fascinated with traumatic injury. I worked on the west side of Orlando, and if you've ever been there, it's kind of a rough neighborhood, so we had a lot of shootings and stabbings and a lot of trauma. So I became fascinated with it. They were my favorite kind of patients. And so when I came to Florida State and found out that I had this incredible skeletal population right there at Florida State, I knew that I was going to specialize in bioarchaeology. And I went on and I've spent the last, since 2001, studying these skeletons and learning about ancient life and health and nutrition and traumatic injury. So we'll just talk about this briefly. My master's thesis was an assessment of skeletal fractures, because again, I'd been looking at traumatic injury for 13 years. I wanted to see what it looked like in the skeleton, and there was a lot of it at Windover. This is probably my favorite bone in the whole collection, if you can have one. It's actually a femur, an upper leg bone of a woman who somehow sustained this massive fracture during life, which, I've laid in bed at night wondering, how did she do that? Because it's, this is the biggest, strongest bone in the body. It takes a tremendous amount of force. In fact, when I was a medic, typically we had femur fractures from, motorcyclists who were struck by cars or pedestrians that were struck by cars. And of course, in the field, we would apply a traction splint and actually pull those bone ends apart to line up the bone and alleviate pain. Well, you can see the result when someone doesn't have traction. What happens when you sustain a femur fracture, you have a lot of muscle mass here, and those muscles contract and they pull those bone ends on top of each other. And you can see that process right here, because without applying traction to pull those bone ends apart, the bone just heals as it is. And you can see that hers actually healed with the bone ends on top of each other. But the fact is, she did survive this injury, and this is a pretty severe injury. It can be life-threatening because you have a large artery that runs, your femoral artery runs behind this bone. But she survived, and we know that because the bone is nice and smooth and remodeled. She would have had a severe limp So you can imagine what life would have been like for the rest of her life, especially for a semi-permanent, hunter-gatherer population that are kind of moving around the landscape. To have such a severe injury not only tells us that she was healthy enough to survive this, but also that she probably had some assistance, that someone was taking care of her. And that's been one of my interests, is looking at, injury and pathology in the archaeological record and being able to infer, caring and nurturing. So someone took care of her during this time when she was convalescing. We also see aspects of this in some of the congenital malformations. What we're looking at here is the base of the spine right here. And this is of a young boy. He only lived to be about 17 or 18 years of age, but he was born with spina bifida. And spina bifida is the failure of these spinous processes to fuse around the spinal cord during embryological development. And about 10% of the population has this to some degree, but his was a little more serious than that. It looked like he was paralyzed from the waist down. He had massive infection of his lower extremity, of his lower legs. So life would have been really difficult for him. He wouldn't have been able to walk. Someone would have had to carry him anytime the group moved. So again, just like the woman with the femur fracture, we know that they were caring for each other. People that were ill or injured were not abandoned. They were actually still part of the community. And that, to me, is what is really fascinating about looking at ancient pathology. There was also a lot of arthritis, and we see that in this bony rim around the vertebra. This is called osteophytosis, and it's a natural kind of progressive disorder that we all get when we age. But we see a lot of wear and tear on the skeletons at Windover because life was very physically demanding. If you can imagine having to hunt for all your food, gather all your water, build your shelter, make your clothes. I mean, everything is physically demanding. We squawk when we have to get up and change the channel on the TV. So you can imagine how demanding life was for them. And we see that reflected in their skeletons. We also see signs of infection. And infection impacts bone just like it impacts soft tissue. Bone is a very dynamic tissue. And so it reacts when it's insulted with whether it's infection or traumatic injury. And the way this shows up is this kind of cloaking, this buildup, white buildup on the bone. This is a lower leg bone, a tibia of a young child. In fact, this bone is so affected with infection that it has a little pathological fracture right through the shaft of the bone, because bone becomes weakened by disease and can actually fracture on its own. Their teeth were in horrendous shape. I showed you the picture before of their wearing down. We call that attrition. And they had severe attrition at Windover. In fact, by the time someone was in their 30s, if they were lucky enough to make it into their 40s, their teeth were pretty much worn down to the gum line. And that's because they had heavy amounts of grit in their diet. They were using their teeth as tools. So they were putting a lot of forces on their teeth, and it shows up. What we're actually seeing here, the surface of the enamel has been completely worn down, and you're actually seeing the dentin, the interior part of the tooth. And they had some really interesting anomalies among their teeth too. This is a young, probably a teenager. We know that because we can look at the wisdom teeth, the third molars. We're looking at the upper, the maxilla, the upper jaw. But we see that this child's wisdom teeth were just starting to erupt, so we know it's probably about 18, 19 years of age. But this child has a lot of interesting things going on, and that's why I love showing this. First of all, for some reason, he's retaining one of his baby teeth, one of the deciduous teeth, and we know that because it's all worn down. And you can see that little premolar trying to erupt, but it's having a trouble doing it because of that tooth. So you can see how overcrowded the jaw is. But another interesting aspect is if you look at these incisors, these front teeth, if you run your tongue over the back of your teeth, they're probably smooth for most of you in this room. Well, what we see among Native American remains is this unique shoveling. They look like little tiny shovels, and those are called shovel-shaped incisors. And those were one of the first physical indications, one of the first traits that kind of keyed us in that Native Americans were related to Asian populations, because we see this type of shoveling only in Asian populations. We see it nowhere else in the world. But this is a beautiful example of that. We also see heavy kind of patterned wear. You know, we can tell that someone was using their teeth for certain tasks based on these wear patterns. And this individual, you can see that his front teeth are just kind of worn into an arch. So he was probably maybe grasping something. This happened in a lot of the males within the population. So they may have been the ones kind of stripping the palm fibers to make the textiles perhaps. But this is my favorite skull in the whole collection. He's a very robust male. It's burial 152. And he's just beautiful. And this is the one I have tattooed on my back. So I carry him around with me every day. We also have indications of what we call premortem tooth loss, people that lose teeth before death, because we can kind of use that as a gauge for overall oral health. You know, if you have healthy teeth, they tend to stay in your mouth. If you have unhealthy jaws, your teeth tend to fall out. So we've used that as a gauge in archaeology to see what the oral health of populations was like. And you can see at Windover, this individual was just left with 3 little teeth, 1, 2, 3, in their lower jaw at the time of death. But they were able to survive. Those teeth, all the rest of the teeth, the crypts have been resorbed, that bone has healed over. So they may have been, you know, eating some sort of gruel or softened meal to survive. And this is also one of my favorite pictures from the population, because we have a lot of children in the pond. In fact, 52% of the individuals that came out of the pond were children. Child mortality was very high, as you can imagine. A child was very lucky to make it to about their 3rd birthday. If they made it that far, they tended to survive, have a little better chance. But we still have a lot of dead children from the pond. So we can see different developmental processes in the act. And I love showing this to children. On the rare occasion when I speak to school groups, I'll show them this and I'll ask them, I always ask them, you know, why do your baby teeth fall out? And they're like, well, I don't know. And they don't realize it's because those permanent teeth are actually pushing those teeth out. And this is a perfect picture of this, because this child has what we call mixed dentition, meaning they still have baby teeth, the molars right back here, but all of these beautiful permanent teeth have erupted. But unfortunately, this child died in the process. You can see the canines are just starting to erupt through the jaws. So it's kind of a beautiful developmental snapshot of what this process is like in life. We also see signs of nutritional stress. That shows up in the orbits of the eyes. This is called criboorbitalia, and it's caused from either iron deficiency anemia or certain vitamin deficiencies. But a lot of the children at Windover showed this condition. So they were, you know, somehow they weren't getting either enough iron in their diet, or maybe there were seasons where foods were scarce. But what I noticed when I did a survey of all the children that had this condition is, if they were lucky enough to make it into their teen years, this condition tended to be healed up. And meaning the bone was remodeling, they were surviving, they were healing beyond it, only to succumb to something else. We also see this kind of nutritional stress exhibited in the teeth. And that shows up in these enamel defects, meaning these little lines that you see going through the teeth. Now, these teeth are stained from the soil, from the peat, but if you look at these little striations across the teeth, those are enamel defects. When your teeth are developing in your jaws, if you're maybe nutritionally challenged or suffer from infections, you can actually, the enamel that's being laid down actually halts for a period and then will start up again, and then it can halt and start up again. So it causes these little defects in the teeth, and you can see these in people today. You know, when you're talking to someone, check them out, you know, look at their teeth, and you know, I do this all the time. When I'm at the gym, I pass the time by looking at skull shapes and watching people walk by. So you can see some really interesting things if you pay attention. We know what they were eating because we can analyze the stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen in the bones. And what we find at Windover is that they were eating from freshwater resources, riverine sources, and probably supplementing that with deer and any type of critter they could probably get their hands on. We also know that they were utilizing local plant sources because there were 31 different types of food or medicinal plants that were identified at the Windover site. Some of these were identified from possible gut content, meaning clusters of seeds found within the abdominal region. And many of those seeds that were found actually have medicinal purposes, like nightshade and elderberry. But some of the plants, like prickly pear, was actually used as a grave good. And here's a modern one for comparison, but here's a big prickly pear cactus pad that was placed on the back legs of someone. Here's the burial, face down, and this prickly pear pad was placed on the back legs as some sort of offering. We don't know what it means, but it must have had some significance to whoever put it there. So we can look at all these different aspects on the skeleton, and that's what the back half of the book talks about, is all the different things we can tell from looking at skeletons and looking at pathology among the skeletons. We get a sense of the type of biological stress a population was under, meaning what types of pathologies were they encountering. We can look at traumatic injury and infer levels of violence among people. You know, was there a lot of warfare going on? Was there a lot of internal strife? And we can actually track levels of strife through populations as it, you know, waxes and wanes depending on social structure and population. So looking at pathology in the skeleton can give us a lot of information. Gives us an idea of kind of the challenges that people were facing on a daily basis. Because if you can imagine, I don't know if anybody in here camps, but if you've ever been camping in Florida in the summer, it's pure hell. So you can imagine living there without air conditioning, no bug spray, and then being challenged, you know, either with infection or that horrible dental disease. Whenever I would sit in the lab with the skeletons, you know, I'd look at their teeth and I'd just try to imagine for a moment what it was like living with those conditions. You know, the boy with spina bifida, what his life would have been like on a daily basis. And so that's what, to me, what is so interesting about looking at skeletons, because it gives us so much information. And what this allows us to do is reconstruct lifestyle in the past. And at Windover, because of the incredible aspects of this site, not only the site's discovery, but bringing all of these people together to analyze it and learn from all the different aspects of the things that came out of that pond, we know what life was like 7,000 years ago in Florida, and that's the whole purpose of archaeology. And so that's why I wanted to write the book, so people could kind of appreciate that, what that was like. Not only how exciting it was finding and discovering the site, but all the information we've been able to glean from it. And so I hope you take a look at the books in the back. I also brought my first book called Chasing Bones, which also talks a lot about Windover, but it tells the story of how I switched from, you know, being a firefighter medic to becoming a bioarchaeologist, and all the places I've been able to work around the world. I've been able to learn about different cultures by looking at skeletons. Places like, you know, a 2,000-year-old burial mound in Ukraine, doing work for the Park Service in St. Croix, working at a medieval castle up in England. So each of these different locations, I've learned different things about past cultures through the bones. So please take a look at the books in the back. And I think now we have time for a couple of questions. If we want to turn off the lights. Yes, sir. Thank you. Well, we know based on genetic data that Native Americans originated from Asia. Now, when they got here, how they got here is very contentious. In fact, if you ever want to watch a good fight, go to one of the conferences where the early archaeologists are arguing about the peopling of the Americas, because we don't know exactly. But we do know the DNA from Windover also indicated Asian stock. So all of the genetic, I know that there are different theories of, well, people could have come over the Atlantic, and because their stone points look similar. But to me, the real telling evidence is the genetics. And so far, all of that indicates Asian origin. What I found at Windover was there appeared to be no intentional injury. I mean, all of the fractures, you know, I was really curious what type of fractures they sustained, where they were on the body, and who had more of them, males versus females, because sometimes that can be pretty telling as well. But they were equal distribution. The fractures that were there were a lot of them. Out of the 168 people, there were 90 fractures within the population. So they were breaking a lot of bones. But it appeared they were doing it accidentally. There was one elderly female who had a variety of facial fractures. And Doran and I used to always argue about this, because Doran would come up with very elaborate, you know, tales. Like there were a lot of forearm fractures, and he was convinced because they kept falling out of their canoes. Even though we don't have 7,000-year-old canoes, he thinks that still, they probably had canoes and they were probably stumbling out of them. And so we would argue about that. But this one female just had a lot of different types of facial fractures. And we finally just decided that she was probably just a pain in the ass. And she was just difficult to deal with. But there was one individual who was found with an antler tine embedded in his hip, and he was kind of a young male, about 20 years of age. The antler tine was still embedded. There was no healing around it, so it occurred around the time of death, probably the cause of death. He was also buried without, there was no cranium, so he may have been decapitated. There were no actual cut marks on any of the cervical vertebra. But, and Doran has talked about this. I think his view is that perhaps this was, you know, someone who was killed and sacrificed. But one, I don't think they would have put him in the pond if it was an enemy, because that's a lot of trouble to bury someone there. And two, it could have been accidental in nature. We don't know. You know, I try to shy away from elaborate tales of what could have happened. That's why I just like looking at the pathology, because it's a little more concrete. But so we don't have a lot of indication of any interpersonal strife, and I don't think you find that in archaic populations in general. You know, there weren't hordes of people on the landscape. You know, we see rise in intentional injury and violence as people become more crowded and start fighting for resources. And, you know, I haven't done an assessment of trauma across archaic populations, but from what I've read and gathered, we don't see a lot of that. The health aspects, they had a lot of pathology, but if you look at the distribution, the kind of the death curve, they were also living pretty well into it. So, you know, we have something called the osteological paradox, as I'm sure you know, that if you have two skeletons, you know, one skeleton shows all sorts of pathology, and the other shows no pathology whatsoever. Well, which one's healthier? You know, automatically people say, oh, the one showing all the sickness. Well, both these people are dead. Now, this one managed to stay alive and have all this different pathology. This one succumbed to something that knocked him off very quickly. So that's the paradox. Who is healthier? So at Windover, that was my dissertation research, is looking at the levels of pathology in Windover and comparing them to other populations. So it's kind of hard to tease out. The way we do it is we look at how long people are living. And at Windover, the average lifespan was probably only in the 40s, but we do have some individuals that lived into their 50s and 60s. So I think they were a pretty robust population. They were able to sustain a lot. No carvings like that. I mean, they found shell and things like that as grave goods. But if you look at the nature of the interment, to me, this speaks definitely of ritual. Anytime you see people doing something rather elaborate over and over again, doing the same thing, I mean, that was a lot of trouble. It's much easier to just kind of roll the dead person into the woods and move camp, you know. But they were going through a lot of trouble, and they were doing it year after year, generation after generation. So I think there was some sort of ritual purpose. They utilized this pond because it happened to be a pond where they were close to, and we know that they were getting them in the ground within about 48 hours, because one thing that brain tissue told them was that it lacked decompositional gas vacuoles, and the gas vacuoles develop within 48 hours after death, and because they didn't have that, they know that they were getting them into the ground within that 48-hour period. So, you know, they were close enough to do that. But why they were, you know, they could have just been returning to this site because it had good plants and animals, you know, it was a seasonal site, or they could have been returning for the pond. We just don't know. Yeah, they did test the Windover site, and it was uniquely neutral, and a lot of the ponds around were much more acidic, so yeah, it probably wouldn't have preserved. But Windover is one of 5 mortuary ponds in Florida that have been discovered. Most of them, of course, have been discovered by accident. But unfortunately, Windover is the only one that's been systematically excavated. So the information we've gained from those other ponds is really minimized. I mean, some of it's useless. Bay West and Republic Groves, those were just salvage excavations. So we don't know, you know, and it's hard to do a systematic survey because, like Bay West and Republic Groves, those are gone. We can't test, and I don't know if the pH was ever tested in those. I'd have to look at Purdy's book. So we don't know. No, unfortunately, you know, we would need DNA from contact period Native Americans, and as you know, most of those are gone. You know, the few that survived the European incursions were sent to Louisiana, some were sent to Cuba, but they've been integrated into other populations. And to get DNA from skeletal remains from contact period sites is difficult because those are in the ground, and Florida has very acidic soil, so it degrades bone and thus DNA very quickly. So we haven't been able to do that. So we don't know, you know, people ask me that all the time, you know, did these people, did they become the Ais, you know, Timucuan, who were they? And we just don't know. They could have just died off. 7,000 years is a long time, so we just don't know. Yeah, it really is. And, you know, one thing that always intrigued me was comparing Windover to these other mortuary ponds, because we see kind of remnants of similar things, like at Little Salt Springs, they had one slough burial that was buried in kind of a mucky area, and she had a lot of similar qualities to Windover. You know, there was grapevine placed over the body, she was extended, which was unique. So there were hints that, and they've discovered these wooden stakes at at Little Salt Springs and I think Bay West. So, you know, that kind of speaks of some sort of cultural continuity maybe across the state. But again, you know, the nature of the archaeology at these other sites was so poor that it's hard to do that. But thank you for doing the math, because I've never sat down and calculated that out. That goes beyond my math skills, unfortunately. Yes, ma'am. There is a small museum in Cocoa, the Brevard Museum of History and Science. It's located on the Brevard Community College campus, kind of behind the campus, and they have a small Windover exhibit. In fact, it's the only Windover exhibit in existence. It's a very small museum. They're only open a couple of days a week. But they have a nice little exhibit, and they have they have photographs from the excavations. They have a mock-up burial showing one of the really elaborate burials with all the artifacts. They run a documentary on a loop, so you can sit down and watch a documentary on the site that was done back in 2001. So that's really the only exhibit. Although I did meet with a representative from the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. She came down and contacted me just 2 weeks ago. I took her to the site, and now we're going to try to develop a special exhibit up in Washington on the Windover site, because they're really trying to highlight how complex culture was prior to European contact. And so we're talking about doing an article in their membership magazine and then pitching a special exhibit. So that would be fantastic. No, the site, this is a modern day picture of the site. It just looks like a little mucky pond. At the end of the third field season, they filled in the pond. It's now an archaeological landmark, so it is protected. Jim Swan was gracious enough to donate the pond itself and 5 adjacent lots surrounding it to a preservation organization, and so it's in safekeeping. You know, I doubt they'll ever go back to the pond unless something, conditions within the pond change. But it's within a housing development. There is a historic marker that's placed outside of the community to let people know that within this area, this significant site is there. But they kind of keep it under wraps. They don't. The residents are very persnickety about people coming around the site. So they're all in Florida. In fact, we find this type of burial practice only in Florida and only during the Archaic period. So it's a very unique aspect of Florida prehistory. Nowhere else in the world do we find people utilizing small bodies of water for cemeteries. We have the bog bodies from Europe, but those are typically bodies that have been dumped into a bog. They're not formal cemeteries. So this is incredibly unique. Well, this site was excavated back in the 80s prior to NAGPRA, and NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was a very important piece of legislation that was passed in 1990, it affects how we approach Native American remains, how we house them, what we hold on to, the funerary objects as well, because Native Americans have very different perspectives and belief systems, especially concerning the dead, than most of North America. And so that it tries to create a balance between respecting their beliefs and still being able to study the past. But one aspect of NAGPRA is having to show cultural continuity between populations. And because Windover goes so far back in the past, and because Florida Aboriginals were basically wiped out with European contact, we don't have that cultural continuity in Florida. So we don't have the activism that we see out, like places out west where we do have cultural continuity, where we have groups of Native Americans that are living out west that have been there as long as they can remember. Florida is unique. We've really suffered such devastating losses of Aboriginal populations that we don't have that. They're housed in a special collection up at Florida State. And I served as collections manager the entire time I was there and worked under Glenn Doran. He was my advisor both for my master's and my dissertation. So I was collections manager over our anthropology department. And so I oversaw the Windover collection as well. Probably through the erection of those sticks, placing the erection of sticks, anchoring that body to the base of the pond would have kept it from floating. It also protected it from predators because those 168 people are made up of 10,000 different bones. And I know because I looked at every single one of them for both my master's and my dissertation. And out of those 10,000 bones, only 6 bones show any sign of carnivore damage or gnawing. So the sticks also protected the bodies once they were placed in the pond. They do know that it was a perpetual pond because they did coring throughout the pond, and it showed that the peat had began developing 10,000 years ago. So it has been a pond, because that was one of their first questions. Was this actually a pond, or was it just a cemetery that became inundated? So that was one of the research questions, but the coring proved that no, this was a perpetual pond, and I'm sure it changed sizes based on, level of moisture and drought in the area. Glenn says that they feel they got the majority of skeletons out. By the 3rd field season, they were finding less and less bone. But Jim Swan had moved the road twice to get it out of the way of the excavations. But even at the end of the 3rd field season, they were still striking bone, working up to the roadway. So there are more skeletons in the pond. How many more, we don't know. But that's a good question. You'd really have to date every person in the pond to find out, which it's not feasible because it's so expensive, and plus so many of the burials became commingled because the base of a pond is very dynamic. Different water levels change over time, so you have movement and sloughing and degradation of the base of the pond. So that would be really hard to tell. It didn't look like bodies were stacked. It looked like they were distributed, but toward the center, you do have kind of a central sinking aspect because this is a natural spring-fed pond. So that would be really difficult to tell, but interesting to think about that. Yeah, or it possibly could have been gut content. There's a lot of controversy because those seed accumulations were found in the belly. Was that Michelle Williams? Yeah. Yeah, because she and I did a joint paper presentation. In fact, in the May-June edition of Archaeology magazine, not this past summer, but the year before, 2011, I did an article for Archaeology magazine about evidence for medicine at Windover. So if you can find a copy of that magazine, where I looked at the different pathologies of the individuals and those found with these medicinal plants, and this elderly lady was one of them. She had severe osteophytosis of the spine. Her spine was fused in huge chunks. And yeah, she was found with 3,000 berries, in her abdominal region. So it's really interesting, and that article, in fact, the article, or kind of an alternation of, is the last chapter in the book, looking at evidence for medicine, because not only I'm sure they were using plants, I believe they were also splinting their injuries, because one thing I noticed looking at the fractures, most of the bones were well healed and well aligned, so I think they were splinting, maybe using slings, some of those textiles. They were definitely caring for each other and themselves, because the greatest evidence is all the long-term pathology we see. Just like we see with Egyptian tombs, they prepare the person for that journey and with food and things like that. Well, thank you all for coming. Take a look at the books, and I'll stay after if you have questions.